This is Dr. Mark Trexler with the Climate Countdown. Today, exploring some of the worldviews currently in play when it comes to the future of energy. There's a famous quote: "Prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future." And that certainly applies to thinking about whether, how, and when the global economy will decarbonize, whether in the nearer term in order to tackle climate change, or in the longer term because it just makes technological and economic sense. After all, we didn't abandon the Stone Age because we ran out of stones. The climate science community has called for the world to rapidly decarbonize in order to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. This is commonly described as net zero by 2050, which scientists suggest would limit the increase in average global temperature to an arguably manageable 1.5 degrees Celsius. But there are different schools of thought about whether net zero by 2050 is possible or even desirable. Some observers are more concerned about the near-term economic and societal impacts of rapidly decarbonizing than they are about the arguably longer-term physical impacts of climate change. We can probably all agree, as explored in numerous fictional books, including the well-known 1 Second After series, that the instant decarbonization that might follow a major solar storm or electromagnetic pulse attack would be catastrophic. As soon as you get away from instant decarbonization scenarios, however, all bets are off when it comes to debating the whether, when, and how of global decarbonization. Mainstream climate advocates point to modeling suggesting that the global economy could completely decarbonize by 2050, and that the transition would even be economically beneficial. Other observers, while advocating for an aggressive response to climate change, question our ability to decarbonize so rapidly, in part pointing to the enormous amount of energy needed to build out an entirely renewables and storage-based global energy infrastructure. One such analysis concludes that the best we may be able to do is limiting average global temperature rise not to 1.5 degrees, but closer to 3.5 degrees Celsius. Then you get to observers who acknowledge that climate change is happening, but question whether the risks of climate change will manifest as rapidly and broadly as scientists suggest. In the view of these observers, we have time to deal with the climate change problem without triggering the problems of an overly rapid decarbonization in the near term or a climate catastrophe in the longer term. The last category of thinking I'll lay out is what one writer has termed energy humanism, suggesting that rapid decarbonization would be economically ruinous, would leave billions of people condemned to energy poverty, and would ultimately lead to societal collapse. Instead, the author argues, we should expand fossil fuel use in order to lift those billions of people out of energy poverty and use that energy to insulate ourselves from the effects of climate change. Because predicting the future is indeed impossible, there's no way to say with any certainty which of these futures will come to pass. But we can point out that choosing between the scenarios comes down to assessing the relative risks of decarbonization versus climate change. And there may be risks with decarbonizing too rapidly. But at the end of the day, climate change is an irreversible planetary experiment that we're carrying out with the only planet known to be inhabitable in the entire universe. Intentionally delaying or avoiding decarbonization with the expectation of being able to use fossil fuels to largely counter the impacts of climate change is literally playing a version of planetary Russian roulette. Not with 1 out of 6 of the gun's chambers containing a bullet, but more like 5 out of 6. Not great odds. This is Mark Trexler with the Climate Countdown. Dig deeper into this and other Climate Countdown topics at our website, climatecountdown.climatesites.net. And thanks for listening.